I'm delighted today to welcome Dean Spears, author of the national bestseller After the Spike, Population, Progress, and the Case for People, written with Mike Geruso. Dean is Associate Professor of Economics at the University of Texas at Austin, where he directs the Population Wellbeing Initiative and is founding executive director of the Research Institute for Compassionate Economics. He's also co-author with Diane Coffey of the award-winning Where India Goes, which examines sanitation challenges and stunted development. Welcome, Dean.
Hi, thanks for having me, and thanks folks for being here.
So, for most of our lives, one dominant narrative about humanity's future has centered on overpopulation. Too many people straining a planet with limited resources. But as your book's striking spike visual shows, we are witnessing something unprecedented. Fertility rates have plummeted more quickly than anyone predicted. Two-thirds of people now live in countries with below replacement birth rates. And in decades, the global population might actually start declining. And you argue in the book that we might soon have too few people to sustain the innovation, prosperity, and progress that we've come to expect. So, how did you begin working on this project, and how did you decide to write the book?
Yeah, I'm an economics professor who studies children and demography, and for a long time, my research was about early life health and mortality. Especially in India, how tall children grow and early life death rates. But what got me, I've been thinking about population for a long time, in part because of I had one strand of research collaborating with philosophers about sort of questions of how do we evaluate policies when the population changes. I have one strand of research collaborating with climate modelers and climate policy research about sort of how, the optimal carbon tax, for example, interacts with population size. And I always knew that I sort of wanted to talk more about these things to a broader audience. The thing that switched this over to being a book about global depopulation and thinking like, wow, now is the time to do it and not later in my life, is just coming to understand the basic facts. Like you say, I didn't, like a lot of people, I didn't recognize these things until, a few years ago. I started seeing that birth rates were low, not just in some places, but in a lot of places. My research is largely about India, and I got into a disagreement with some other professors about child height that caused me to have to look in the same data set that I usually do about height and mortality, but look how it differs by family size. Like, so kids from smaller families taller or whatever than kids from larger families and smaller families, and that just sort of caused me to notice that the birth rate in India is below 2, and the family sizes in India are smaller than I thought. So that's the sort of fact that really pushed me into thinking, wow, there's a bigger story here than people are telling about this, and that's how.
So, we'll talk about it later because I think it's a fascinating case and very hard to explain. Going
Mhm,
back to the core statements that you make in the book,
mhm,
um, demographers have been wrong for decades, and you have this chart in the book that shows two futures, one of depopulation and stabilization. There
mhm,
are just very subtle differences between
mhm.
the kind of distribution of births that leads to depopulation versus the latter. So why do you think previous forecasts were so wrong, and what makes you feel confident that this is something urgent that we need to think about
Mhm.
at this moment?
Yeah, I mean, so there's, you say, why have some folks missed this? And I think, there's different categories of missing it, right? I mean, there's somebody like Paul Ehrlich talking about the population bomb in 1968. And, that's just somebody who, you know, wasn't a demographer, wasn't trained in population science. But we all know, humanity knows more about demography and population science than we did a few decades ago. A lot of people around the world live in a country where there isn't vital registration, where all births and deaths aren't registered. And so the only reason that we really know much about the demography in those places are these high quality demographic and health surveys, which take a representative sample of women, ask them about their birth history histories. But those haven't existed forever. Those basically started well into the 80s. And so, we've had about like 4 decades of these. And so we just know more facts than anybody did, not that long ago. But I want to talk a little bit about the things we can know and the things we can't know. And I think it might help to just show a picture, because it's not the case that nobody knew anything about this. I think there's more of sort of the popular understanding being different from some of the scientific understanding. So why don't I show a picture for a few minutes, if that's okay? And
Yeah, go for it. You should be able
yeah,
to share.
great. So are you guys seeing a graph of the world's population over time, right? And so,
Yes.
So here's where we are so far. So the horizontal axis is time, the vertical axis is the size of the world population. And what I want you to see is that humanity's size, our numbers, changed slowly for millennia. There weren't very many of us, and it wasn't changing very fast. So 10,000 years ago, there were about 5 million of us worldwide. That's smaller than Metro Atlanta today. At the beginning of the Common Era, there were 300 million people. So that's less than the Indian states of Uttar Pradesh and Bihar, less than live in the United States. But then this changed. And the core reason it changed, and that's sort of the reason I'm showing this, is not because people started having more babies. The core reason that the size of the population started growing fast is because survival improved, and especially early life survival. Mortality rates fell. We got better at keeping one another alive, and we got especially better at keeping children alive through things like the germ theory of disease, sanitation, toilets, later on, vaccines and antibiotics, also nutrition. But the babies who were born became more likely to survive. And so population growth became rapid and exponential. By the early 1800s, there were 1 billion of us. In the century after that, that doubled to 2 billion of us. And the century after that, it doubled twice or quadrupled to today's 8 billion. So today, what we've all seen is a populous world where there are not only a lot of people, but it's growing fast, and things are getting better. The absolute number of global poor has been falling, lifespans are growing, and the babies who are born are more likely to survive, and they grow taller than children used to. But, and this is what we're here to talk about, something new is happening, and it's about to change again because population growth is slowing. For decades, as we were just saying, all along the worry has been about overpopulation in popular narratives, but also all along birth rates have been falling. And that's what I'm wanting to emphasize, that it's not that the population is growing because people are having more children. Birth rates are falling. We're just doing a better job keeping one another alive. And so ever since 1968, the size of the world population has been growing more and more slowly. Now, a growth rate that's slowing doesn't necessarily have to slow to zero, but it is projected to slow to zero, meaning that some year soon, the number of deaths will match the number of births. And the UN puts that peak in the 2080s, which means in some sense we're between two peaks right now. 2012 was the peak number of babies born, 146 babies born worldwide. That's already behind us. Nobody really even commented on it or noticed it when it happened. But we still have a few decades until the size of the world population peaks because people are still aging and death rates are still falling. But, probably we're going to reach that. Nobody knows exactly when. We don't have a crystal ball, but a kid born today has a pretty good chance of living to see the peak in the size of the world population, whether it's 6 decades from now or a little bit sooner even, as some other population scientists say. So if we are going towards a moment of zero population growth where the number of deaths equals the number of births, then the question is what happens next? And so that goes back to this, what can population scientists know and what can we know? And the thing that I want to emphasize is, we can conclude some important things without knowing everything about what's going to happen. And the tools to do that are these if-then tools of population science, where you specify, some hypotheses or some assumptions about vital rates, about birth rates or death rates, and then you plug it in and see if those birth rates and death rates are what happened, then what would result. And so one core tool is called the cohort component model. It's what the UN and other demography groups use to make their projections. And we can ask that tool, what if birth rates around the world converge towards an average of 1.6? Now, there's no reason to be confident that that's what's going to happen. We're not saying we know it's going to be 1.6 in particular, but it's worth talking about and thinking about 1.6 because that turns out to be about what it is in the US today. So, that's a sort of familiar possibility for those of us who live in the US. We're saying, what if parenting and families in the future are kind of like they are in the US now? That would mean birth rates fall in a lot of places, and it would mean birth rates rise in an awful lot of places. They're lower than that in Europe and East Asia. According to the World Bank, the 115 richest countries have an average birth rate of 1.5. But we can ask this question, if then, if birth rates converge towards an average of 1.6 for the world as a whole and stay there, then this would be the future we see. And what that tells us, nobody should think this is exactly what's going to happen, right? Don't trust the exact numbers. But the point is that if that's what happened, then our populous times that we've seen where so much is getting better would just be a brief anomaly in history on the world page. And what I also want you to see is that this unprecedented future, this future that'd be radically different than we've seen, would result from birth rates that are common and familiar around the world today. It doesn't have to be the case that birth rates keep falling and falling and falling, right? For this to be the future that happens. All that would happen is birth rates would have to go below 2 and stay there. Go to, for example, where the US is at 1.6 or Texas is at 1.8 and stay there or stay near there. And that would result in long-term exponential global depopulation. It doesn't even have to be, 1.6. Here's other alternatives, 1.8, like in Latin America or France, 1.2, like in China or Chile or Puerto Rico. And we see basically the same story. Yes, at different exact speeds, but basically the same story. And we also, this graph goes out thousands of years because I think it tells us something about how different the future could be from the past, I think, on that time scale. But if you don't like that time scale, you don't have to. We could instead say, if the future birth rate is, something like 1, then the size of the world population would fall to a quarter in 3 generations. 3 generations you can wrap your hands around, right? Or if it's 1.5, one way of looking at it is if the average birth rate goes to 1.5, which is pretty normal around the world today, then the size of the world population would shrink by 10% every decade and shrink by 2/3 every century. So within a human lifetime, you would see the size of the population fall by half as many people when you die as when you were born. That's pretty big, and it doesn't require us talking about thousands of years. So I'll stop here with the message that we don't have to know everything to know this big picture if-then fact. If birth rates for the world as a whole go below 2 and stay there, we'll get exponential and rapid depopulation. The question is, should we think that it's a likely and plausible future that birth rates for the world as a whole will go below 2? And we can talk about the evidence of that, but we don't have to know exactly what the birth rate's going to be. We don't have to have a crystal ball. The birth rate doesn't have to fall forever and ever. The future doesn't have to be different than it is in the United States or Europe today, or even Latin America, right? It would just take the world's average birth rate for a long time being below 2.
So I'll pause briefly here and invite any questions that the group has about what Dean has talked about so far.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, go for it.
So what explains that the rise and fall between countries is so coordinated? And why don't they happen at random times, as opposed to this like spike all at once and decay all at once?
I'm not 100% sure I understand the question. You're saying, like, let's say that we learned that, let's say we didn't previously know that over the 20th century, birth rates were falling. And let's say we learned that over the 20th century, birth rates had fallen in Italy. What is it about humanity that would cause learning that to then make us think that it's more likely than before to believe that birth rates also fell in Brazil and China, as opposed to just being agnostic on that question?
Right. Is it why is that? Like, I assume women in India are not looking at the decisions of American women to make their own decisions. So why, at this point in time in the 2020s, are they converging on less than 2 children?
Mhm. So, I mean, we haven't really talked about it yet, but you're asking about one of the sort of most important facts here. And, so I left it at, if we think that birth rates uh, are going to fall below 2 for the world as a whole and stay there, then we think depopulation will happen. That's sort of a necessary if then. So why might we think that birth rates are likely to fall below 2? And a core reason from my point of view is that the fall in birth rates is, not just a thing that we see in some places or sometimes, but it's been going on for a long time and in a lot of places, right? So you're asking, in some sense, the biggest question, which is, why is this such a broadly shared phenomenon? It's not something that's just happening right now. As long as we have records, we see birth rates falling, from around like 6 for the world as a whole in 1800 to 5.5 in 1900 to 5 on average when the UN starts in 1950. And so to me, I mean, I just want to like pause for a second before we get into the why question, the sort of like what question of what we think is likely to happen in the future. It helps me see that the world is, that this is a likely future, that birth rates are likely to fall, that it is something we see in such disparate places, suggesting that there really are, headwinds against parenting or whatever the forces are that make people decide not to have children. They're pretty broadly shared. And so what's going on? Why is this happening? I don't think we necessarily need to know the answer to that question to know what's likely. But it's also interesting and worth thinking about, and perhaps important in the search for any sort of responses that we might want to confront this. And I think, one of the things that we see is that everybody sort of has their theories, but none of the theories seem to fit all the facts and fit all the places. There are really important exceptions for everything. In the US, for example, you're likely to hear a narrative about affordability. Kids are just too expensive. And of course, kids are expensive. I'm a dad, I know that. But if what we're trying to explain is people choosing fewer children than they used to, it's hard for that to think of that as being about affordability because people on average, essentially everywhere, are richer than they used to be, and we see birth rates falling. Whatever it is people value, they could afford more of it. We see richer people having fewer children. We see countries with more generous social safety nets, like in Northern Europe, having smaller birth rates. We see places where college is essentially free, university is highly subsidized, like Canada, having much lower birth rates. We even see, if you're into these sort of microeconometric studies, if you look at young women who win the lottery and compare it to young women who barely don't win the lottery, we see that they don't go on to have more children. So it doesn't seem to be that story. Another class of stories that we hear is, it's something about social conservatism falling apart. And so maybe people talk about the retreat of religion, but, then look at Latin America, where 90% of people tell Pew surveyors that they're Christian, and the birth rate's an average of 1.8. Look at the fact that every U.S. state has fallen below 2. The ones that are more socially conservative and the ones that are more socially liberal. Look at India, where religion is still very important in essentially everybody's life to some degree or other. People consider themselves to belong to religions. We still see birth rates below 2. Birth rates are falling for Mormon people. Birth rates are falling for Amish people. So it doesn't seem to be that. Sometimes you hear people talk about the retreat from marriage. That's why birth rates are falling. But of course, that's complicated. If people are less motivated to get married than before, in part, that's because they have a different idea of what families they want. But again, I think this is where the example of India is very instructive. Because marriage there remains almost universal. Divorce remains rare. People start having children in their early 20s, an average age at first birth of 21. So it's not this story of delaying marriage, delaying family formation. And then, of course, like some people say, the problem is too much feminism. And that's certainly not what I think, but it's also not what the evidence says. If you think, if you think the problem is, women in the labor force, there is an important story to talk about conflicts between career and family, to cite the title of Claudia Golden's book. And I think that is important for a lot of people's decision making, especially in places like the United States, that India has a female labor force participation of 40%. Still has a birth rate below 2, and look at South Korea. That's nobody's idea of a feminist paradise. It's with the most unequal country in the OECD by the gender wage gap, and it has the lowest birth rate in the gender wage gap. So it doesn't seem to be about too much feminism. If anything, the experience of South Korea suggests the reverse, that if you put all the burden on one part of the population, then they're going to say no, thank you. So I went through this long laundry list. When I did it last week at Penn, at the University of Pennsylvania, at their population center, somebody said to me, like, so are you saying that everybody's wrong or everybody's right, or what? And I'm sort of saying neither of those things, that really this is just such a convergent outcome, that, a lot of things are pointing in similar directions. People are getting more educated everywhere. People are having higher incomes everywhere. There's more that you can do with your life everywhere. There's more that you can do with your fun everywhere. Whatever the alternative to having an extra kid is for you, whether that's spending more money on one kid's education so that they can go and succeed and get a job, that kid now has more opportunities than they used to. Especially in a lot of the middle income or developing countries. So, on the one hand, whatever it is, it's an alternative to having a kid is sort of subjectively getting better, essentially, everywhere. But that's not really an explanation either. That's almost just a tautological restatement of the fact that people's decision making is shifting. So I don't think anybody has all the answers here. And one of my sort of takeaway messages is just to not trust people who claim to have a simple theory of it all. I think we're just at the beginning of the generations level project of social science that we need to understand this as well as future people will. And so, hopefully 20 years from now, people will be giving better answers to this question.
Well, thank you.
Adam, you also have a question.
Yes, I was going to ask about causation, but I'm sure we'll come back to that more and more. Could you speak to, insofar as there's data available, maybe in the US and in India, how far back can the decline be traced in terms of when does the total fertility rate actually start going below 2 in India and then also in the US?
Yeah. So, here's a graph that this goes back to 1950, because that's when the UN World Population Prospects data come online. So this is sort of as far back as the demographers at the UN have been bold enough to, put a number on every country. There are records and numbers from before then, but it's a spottier historical record where somebody's been able to construct something from what's written in cemeteries, or looking at family Bibles, or like an unusual case where Sweden, for example, collected records before this. And so what we see here is each of these columns is a 25-year time step, and each dot is a country. So, there's already at least Luxembourg below 2 in 1950, and we start to see more and more places fall below 2, lots of places below 2 in 1975. And so today we're at the point where most countries are below 2, and 2/3 of people live in a country that's below 2. But you can see how that's been accumulating over time. And, the bottom has been shifting down and the top has been shifting down. And also the sort of center or mass of the distribution has been shifting down. One of the things that I think even people who've thought about the fact that the average birth rate is falling haven't thought as much about is that because birth rates can only fall so far down to zero, the fact that that birth rates are falling also means that the variance is decreasing. So you can sort of see how they're all getting bunched up down there in the most, the bunchiness at the bottom is going up. In other words, different places are more similar than they used to be. I mean, we keep talking about the example of the US versus India. The difference in the birth rates between the US and India is pretty small, smaller than it's ever been. And if you look within countries, differences are smaller than they've ever been. US whites, US blacks, US Hispanics are not so different in their birth rate on average. In India, the fact that Muslims on average have more babies than Hindus on average has gotten a lot of political history and political attention over the years, sometimes for bad reasons. Sometimes Hindu politicians saying that it's bad that Muslims have a lot of babies, but in fact, the Hindu birth rate and the Muslim birth rate in India are closer together than they've ever been before, and the Muslim birth rate in India is lower than the Hindu birth rate in India was when people first started making these complaints. So part of what we're seeing in the world is this compression and this lower variance. But back to your question of when things have been happening, this is one of the points that we make in the book is that this didn't have to be such a surprise. That because birth rates have been falling for so long, there's a track record of seeing countries fall below 2. And if you see here, I don't know if you can see my cursor, but by 1980, so the top line is the world's average birth rate. So you can see it sort of starting to really decisively move down, although, it would have been higher than this in, 1900, higher than that in 1800, but you see like a bigger downward shift really in the 1970s. A lot of countries fell below 2 in the 1970s. Lots of European countries, Japan, Australia, Canada, fell below 2 in the 1970s. So by 1980, it was already the case that 20% of people lived in a country with a birth rate below 2. And to me, that's a very striking fact that already by 1980, 20% of people lived in a country where the birth rate was below 2, which means that we all could have been a lot more on top of this conversation a long time ago. Now, of course, some people were. Leela Vasaria has been talking about low birth rates in South India for years to decades. Some, demographers in Europe have been talking about low birth rates for years to decades. But sort of a conversation around global depopulation is a little bit new. And this, goes back to the question at the beginning of like what people missed. And I think, a lot of people were so focused on whether overpopulation would be the future, that the question was really like, are birth rates going to fall to 2 or not, without people really considering, oh, wow, and they could fall below 2 and stay there. So you see, for example, the US Social Security Administration having its medium projection for the future be that the US birth rate would go back up to 2. And so year after year, even as the birth rate in the US fell below 2, the Social Security Administration kept projecting that it would just sort of like turn around and go back up to 2. Really only a couple of years ago did that stop being the middle projection. And you can see how if it's your job to be thinking about the long-term solvency of Social Security, you'd be really hoping that average of 2 would be the future. But I mean, a lot of people whose reasoning wouldn't be so motivated were saying the same thing. You see people saying like, oh, it'll be quoted in the book, for example, Brad DeLong, the distinguished economic historian who, we quote because I respect his work so much. In some sense, reading his paper about convergence is part of what inspired me to become an economist. But, he says something like, oh, it looks like the world's not going to be overpopulated overall. The world's going to, level out and go to zero population growth instead. People just sort of didn't see it as a possibility that the birth rate could go below 2 and stay there. And so the purpose of this graph is to say, yeah, not only is it a possibility, it's something that already, before the lifetimes of some of us on this call, we see large fractions of the world being below 2. We see it happening in many places, not just at the world level, but if you look in subdivisions, We see, so the lines in this chart are US states. Every US state has fallen below 2. There are 50 lines. So that means yes, the ones who voted for Trump, and yes, the ones who voted for Biden. And for that matter, within every Canadian province or Australian territory or prefecture of Japan. So we see it in a lot of places. And one of the things that, if you come away from this, I want you to have a few post-it notes in your brain. And one of the post-it notes in your brain, it should be to, stop referring to the recent fall in birth rates in the US since the Great Recession, like we so often see in the popular media. Because yes, birth rates have fallen in the US since the Great Recession, but they were falling in so many places, not just in the US, and they're falling in so many places before the Great Recession. If there is an anomaly, it's that they were so flat in the US for the 80s and the 90s, but they were falling in the US before that too. So it's a much broader phenomenon than we're used to seeing.
So in the book, you make the case that people are important, that depopulation won't solve some of the problems that people have suggested it might solve, like climate change. You've also commented on the fact that, and you just mentioned it as well, that maybe one of the reasons that we are seeing lower fertility rates is because the world is becoming a better place, the opportunity cost of having a child are growing. So how do you reconcile that? Is this just inevitable and we need to look for other solutions, or are more people a good thing and we need to at least achieve stabilization?
Yeah, thanks for asking. I mean, we wouldn't have written the book if we didn't have hope that we could choose an alternative future. But I also, don't want to. One of the things that we wrote the book to say is that this isn't the sort of thing where, if you just pass my favorite piece of legislation or give an executive order of, my favorite 10-point plan, that we should expect things to turn around. We think that building a future where more people think that they can aspire to parenting and combine it with a good life is going to be a generations level project. But I haven't yet said why we would want to do that. So let's talk about the other part of your question first, which is what sort of future should we want? If depopulation is likely, because we know that it's the consequence of a future where birth rates go below 2 for the world as a whole and stay there, and we see a lot of evidence to make us think that it's likely that birth rates will fall below 2, then is that a future we should welcome, or should we want something else instead? Well, a starting point is that a lot of people think that the alternative to depopulation, each generation being smaller than the last, has to be unending population growth, each generation getting larger and larger. And so one of the things that we're trying to say is, no, there's actually a third possibility between those two, which is that the size of the world population stabilizes. And so what we're contrasting is a future of depopulation against the possibility of stabilization. So one type of depopulation would be, or I guess, depopulation in this graph here, that's the heavy black line at the bottom. And that's just the same spike graph I've been showing you, just zoomed in. And we reprint it here to compare it against the possibility of stabilization. And if you notice, there are lots of different stabilization lines in the graph. So, a stabilized future would be one where roughly the size of the world population balances over long periods of time. So comings balance our goings, the size of the population stays roughly the same. That, doesn't have to be exactly true. We don't mean literally every year the population is the same size, but roughly. But although we're going to come around to recommending that, one of the things that we're saying by drawing this graph is that we're not recommending a particular stabilized size, and we're not recommending a particular stabilized year, right? I think that's far more than our climate science, our economic science, than anybody could really hope to say, right? That would just be sort of making it up. So if you think, for example, that the best future would be one where, we're probably going to go over the peak, right? And if you think that the best future would be one where we go down for quite a while before leveling out and stabilizing, maybe at a size even lower than today, right? Which which some people coming from an environmentalist perspective would recommend, then great, that's a form of stabilization. You're on team stabilization, right? If you instead think we should try to stabilize at a larger size and start an increase in birth rates back up to 2 sooner, that's also on team stabilization. We're not really able to say which of those would be better. We sort of have to paint with broader brushstrokes than that, given the bigness and the unprecedentedness of what we know. So what should we prefer? Well, when we're considering what we should prefer, what we start with in the book, that's sort of the middle 2 parts of the book. And what we start with in the book is the good reasons that a lot of people bring up for thinking maybe depopulation is something to welcome, right? What we don't want is for people to be welcoming it in an unconsidered way, to say, oh, depopulation, I didn't know that was coming. Okay, fine, great, right? What we want is for people to be thinking about it. And you're exactly right in the question. For a lot of people, the reasons to welcome depopulation start with the environment, the idea that a smaller population might get us off the hook for some of our environmental challenges. A smaller population might be the solution that we need. Here's Bill Nye talking about Earth's people problem, or Bill McKibben saying that there's a case for smaller families in the environments, and other groups saying similar things. So one of the ways that I start thinking about that, and that we talk about in the book, is with particle air pollution. So little pieces in the air measured PM 2.5, and they're really, really bad for your health. They're really bad for children's health and development. They're bad for older adult mortality. I often live in North India, in Uttar Pradesh, where it gets pretty awful, especially in the winter. It used to get, well, in 2013, it was extremely bad in China also. That sort of sparked people writing about it. And you have environmental writers like David Wallace Wells noticing that particle air pollution, as bad as climate change is and will be, particle air pollution is probably all in all an even bigger killer of humans than climate change. So I'm not talking about a straw man here. So in 2013, the particle air pollution in China was just atrocious. Newspapers around the world called it the airpocalypse. It was measured off the charts, something like 700 on a scale that goes up to 500. And so that's a really big environmental challenge, not a straw man. That was more than a decade ago. What happened next? What happened in the decade after that? Well, in the decade after that, the size of the Chinese population grew. It grew by 50 million people. That's a lot. That's bigger than lots of European countries. It's 1.5 Texases. And as the size of the Chinese population was growing by 50 million people, what happened to particle air pollution in China? It fell by half. And it's not just China. The world's population as a whole grew by 750 million people over this period, and particle air pollution fell for the world as a whole on average. Not everywhere. Not India, for example. Particle air pollution is still pretty bad there. And it's because policy hasn't really confronted it in the same effective way. And I think that tells us something about the resolution of our paradox. The reason that air pollution in China got better, even as the population grew, is because people did something else. Those extra people and everyone else weren't as polluting because policymakers made the decision to make sure that wouldn't happen and implement new technologies or implement existing technologies, bring China closer to the frontier in its design of factories, turn off coal plants, enforce these regulations, and it worked, right? So the thing is, humanity has improved its environmental record before. Not always, but there have been improvements. And those improvements have always been in this way, never by reducing the size of the population. Wherever we've lessened humans' destructive environmental impact, it's not been by lessening the number of humans, it's been by lessening the destructive environmental impact, which is what we saw happen in China in the particle air pollution. It's what happened with other successes. When I was a kid, the big worry was the hole in the ozone layer in the 1980s. But my kids today don't worsen the hole in the ozone layer because of the Montreal Protocol in 1987 that banned the use of chlorofluorocarbons. So I think that's the way to confront our environmental challenges, to confront them. Now, when I say this, sometimes people say to me, but climate change is such an exceptional challenge that, surely every little bit matters, right? And surely we should welcome depopulation at least to help us with climate change. And so I think it's important to understand just how little of a bit that would be with climate change. We're talking about depopulation projected to start maybe 6 decades from now. And 6 decades from now is pretty late relative to the urgency of our environmental challenges. If a kid's born today, they'll be deciding whether or not to have a kid, say, 30 years from now. That's after important targets and deadlines for decarbonization, like 2050. And so, the population, yes, generation to generation, is going to change fast, but year to year or even decade to decade on this immediate timescale relevant for decarbonization, for climate change, it's not going to change fast enough. It's a big ship that's too slow to turn. So really nothing that could happen to birth rates is going to move us off of our most likely trajectory of population size for the coming few years or decades. And that's going to mean that this is all just happening too late for climate change. So if for no other reason, that should persuade us that anything about population change, birth rates, depopulation is all a distraction from our urgent decarbonization goals, our urgent climate goals. So case was our topic one in the case that we should welcome depopulation for the environment. It just doesn't work out. The way that we improve the environment is by reducing per person harms. That's always how it's worked before. It's how it needs to work again. And it's whatever, and even if you disagree with me about that, depopulation is just not going to come fast enough to be a solution to our environmental challenges. Okay, I can pause there if you'd like, if we want to talk about any of that, or I can go on to the next topic. Up to y'all.
Thank you. Very thought-provoking. So I'll pause for questions from the group. Questions, comments? Adam.
Yeah, so I just wanted to clarify. So there's absolutely no instance of depopulation ever having beneficial. I just want to have a sense of how confident you are. I know
global depopulation hasn't happened yet, so it couldn't be responsible for any of the improvements that was happened. That's what I'm saying.
In terms of population collapse localized in localized areas. So I think there was fairly recently a clip of an interview with Martha Nussbaum that was talking about depopulation. And she was advocating it as a response specifically for India's pollution problems. So I'm just wondering if it has ever worked, even on a local scale, if you've seen depopulation solve pollution problems.
Did she give an example? If she's the one saying that's the solution.
She was proposing it as a benefit specifically for India, that they have this terrible pollution problem, depopulation would help solve it.
So, I mean, I think of India's terrible pollution problem as having a lot to do with coal-fired power plants. And that you could have, one coal-fired power plant serving 3 million people, or you could have one coal-fired power plant serving 4 million people, two possible sizes of Kanpur district, which has a coal plant in the middle of it. It's the 3 million people or the 4 million people isn't the problem. The coal plant in the middle of Kanpur district is the problem. And you could have those same 3 or 4 million people with solar or wind or nuclear energy, and their energy generation wouldn't be causing particle pollution. So whatever we might think about this question, we certainly can't say that India has taught us anything about how to reduce particle pollution, because sadly and unfortunately, India hasn't, at least to the degree that really matters here. But my claim that I feel very confident about is that none of the environmental successes that we have seen, and there have been some, the Clean Air Act, reducing sulfur dioxide and acid rain in the US in the 1990s while the population was growing, the taking the lead out of gasoline in the 1970s while the population was growing, right? None of the environmental successes that we have seen could possibly be because of large-scale sustained depopulation, because all of those successes happened while the size of the population was growing.
Okay.
Oh, yes, Shine, go ahead.
This actually has perhaps more to do with the first part of your talk, but somebody commented on a Black Death, and that reminded me that there have been arguments that past negative population shocks like the Black Death or periodic warlords causing famine in China, there seems to be almost a mean reversion to the trend, as opposed to permanently lowering a locale's population. So why is that in the past we have, like sometimes 20, 30% of an area's population dying for some reason and then recovering, but you're saying now the trend is just one way.
Okay, so just to clarify, I don't think this is a question about the environment, right? I don't think we think that
No.
the Black Death had environmental implications. Agreed? You just mean, why did the size and trajectory of the world population continue an upward trajectory after the Black Death? If that's an example of a shock with a reversal, right? Well, why isn't this, right? So, so I think, the Black Death was an example of a temporary increase in mortality, right? What was going to cause global depopulation, if it does, is a sustained decrease in fertility, right? So if the fall in birth rates, I don't know how long, I'm not a scholar of the Black Death, but let's say it lasted 50 years. If the fall in birth rates was only 50 years long, and then things went back to where they were, just like in the Black Death, I presume an increase in death rates happened for about, let's say, 50 years, then back to where they were, right? So if the fall in birth rates goes back to where it is after 50 years and goes to an average of 2.3 or something, which is what it is for the world right now, then we won't have global depopulation. So it's an if-then. If birth rates go back up in the same way that death rates back then went back down, then we won't have global depopulation. So that's sort of like the simplest answer, but there's sort of a deeper thing about the relative importance of death rates and birth rates in determining the size of the future population and what we won't know, right? Which is basically that for long-term population change, what matters is pre-adult death rates. If you have your 1 kids or 2 kids or 3 kids or 0 kids, and then you live another 40 years, right? That's one possibility. Or you have your 1 kid or 2 kids or 3 kids or 0 kids, and then you live another 140 years, right? The second thing would presumably be much better for human well-being, right? And it would also involve a big level shift in this, or a level shift in the size of the world population. But if people were on average having 1.5 kids and living 80 years, or people were on average having 1.5 kids and living 280 years, it would still be the case that generations would be exponentially getting smaller than one another, right? The extra life after you have after you're through the childbearing ages, could determine a level shift in the size of the population, but it wouldn't change the fact that cohort to cohort or generation after generation, the decline would be exponential. That might change the exact speed of depopulation, but wouldn't stop depopulation. Now, if people live 300 years and they have a couple kids in their 20s, a couple kids in their 80s, a couple kids in their 120s, right? That would stop depopulation, but it would be because people were having more children because birth rates went up, and not because of the change in death rates. The thing that could change the size of the population trajectory is variance in pre-adult mortality. In fact, that has been what has caused the size of the world population to grow really fast. But here's the thing, pre-adult mortality is getting pretty low. About 96% of people around the world right now survive to adult childbearing ages. Now, of course, we would rather that be a much higher number than 96%, right? My day job when I'm not writing this book is working on neonatal survival in Uttar Pradesh. And so, we want that number to be much greater than 96%, but 96% is pretty close to one. From the point of view of population change, right? Where there's not a lot of leftover space in there to change how, if pre-adult survival stays at 96% forever, or goes up to 99%, or goes all the way to 100%, it's still basically going to be the birth rate that determines how fast the population changes in the future. Because 96% of 1.68 is 1.6, right? And so there's just not a lot of oomph left in the pre-adult mortality to shape the pace of future population growth, which is another reason to think that it's really going to be birth rates and not death rates that shape the long-term future of the population from where we are now.
Okay. That makes sense. Thank you.
So one thing you touch on in the book is that people are good because people drive progress, they solve problems, and the more people you have, just by sheer volume, you'll have more ideas. That said, historically, we've seen humanity with much smaller populations come up with breakthroughs, and today we have this benefit of connecting previously isolated populations. So there's this multiplier effect that can allow innovation even if there's not sheer volume. Can you tell us a bit more about why more people are still important given some of these things?
Yeah. So we didn't finish talking about why we might want to, welcome depopulation, or why we might think that stabilization is a bad idea. And the huge thing that we hadn't talked about is, gender equity, the fact that parenting is unequal. Society has been unequal in a lot of ways, even where parenting is not involved, and not everyone can get pregnant. And so there's a lot to talk about there, but I'm happy to, bracket that for now. Maybe we'll come back to it and talk about this question about why we might want to, one of the reasons we might think that stabilization is a better future than depopulation. What we say in the book is that other people are win-win. Their lives are good for them. We think that people getting to live good lives is a valuable thing, and their lives are good for you. Their lives are good for you for a number of reasons, including some important economic reasons. One of the important economic reasons is other people on the demand side of the economy. We're used to thinking of other people as, eating our slice of the pie. And, if other people, there are more other people, they eat up more of the pie, there's less left over for us, and we get a smaller piece. But that turns out to miss something important, which is that if you're going to get any pie whatsoever, then it has to be worth somebody's while to bake a whole pie. And it's only going to be worth somebody's while to bake a whole pie if they think they can sell all the slices, which means that you getting a slice of pie better involve other people also wanting a slice of pie. You're more likely to get what you want and need in a future where other people want and need the same thing that you do. And it's not just about pie, of course. You're more likely to be able to help your loved one get the medical treatment they may someday need in a world where there have been more other people who needed the same thing that you do. So that's other people on the demand side of the economy. Surprisingly, they're not your competition. Other people needing what you need helps you get it. But what about other people on the supply side of the economy? This is what the question is about. other people help in creating the stuff, the abundance that ultimately makes its way to you. And a big part of that is ideas and knowledge and know-how and technology in a very broad sense. So what do I mean by technology in a very broad sense? So why are our lives today so much better than lives 200 or 300 years ago, right? It's the same dirt beneath and rocks beneath our feet, the same wind blowing, the same sun shining on us, but we know better and more about what to do with those things. We know, things to make out of that dirt. We can harness the power of that wind and sunshine. And it's not just, high tech like antibiotics and glasses, these amazing physical things that we've constructed, but also social technology like kindergarten or parliamentary democracy or phonics. There's so much that we've learned about, and that we know how to do that people didn't know how to do a few hundred years ago. And that's a core reason why our lives are so much better, safer, longer, richer, fairer, healthier, right? Because we have these resources. But here's the thing. When the macroeconomists who study long-term growth and living standards have tried to quantify or figure out how this has all come about, where the long-term growth and living standards have come from. So the basic thing they figured out is that it really can't be about the accumulation of physical capital goods, machines and stuff like that. That was sort of the old set of theories, starting in the 1960s that, led to the views of international development of like, let's build a bunch of stuff in poor countries, give them tractors, right? But the problem is machines like that depreciate, they have diminishing marginal returns. What really turns out to have to be the thing that drives long-term living standards is more know-how, more ideas, more recipes, right? More techniques. And those turn out to be a special economic resource. Unlike if there's a sick kid here, right, and I treat that sick kid with an antibiotic pill to cure an infection, that antibiotic pill is gone. No one's ever going to take it again, right? No one's going to swallow that pill to treat an infection again. But the recipe for that pill, and more broadly, the germ theory of disease behind it, continues undiminished and unabated. It's 100% there to use to treat the next illness. And the knowledge is 100% there for some scientists to use to develop the next version of it. And so in economics jargon, this is the idea that ideas or knowledge or recipes are non-rival resources. They don't get used up by other people using them. So Paul Romer got the Nobel Prize in Economics in 2018 for working out the ideas behind non-rival economic growth from ideas. And he gives the example of the Pythagorean theorem of right triangles. Like if you're a builder trying to build a house, you can cut 5 inches, 3 inches, and 4 inches to get a right angle and use that to build a house. And you using that knowledge of the 3, 4, 5 right triangle doesn't use it up in any way. The next builder can use a 3, 4, 5 right triangle to build their house too. And so what does all of this have to do with people? What does that have to do with population? Well, ideas just come from the ordinary process of people doing the things they do. Sometimes it's, like me, I'm a professor or R&D at an organization, but sometimes it's just people living their lives, having an idea for a better chocolate chip cookie recipe, or, nurses in Colombia trying to keep underweight babies alive without the care of incubators and rich country machines. And so inventing and refining the techniques of kangaroo mother care and skin-to-skin contact, which, now, babies in Bangladesh and India can, nurses there can use to save lives without in any way depleting or using up that technology. So the non-rivalry of ideas means that as people go about their business, right, and have more recipes and discoveries and ideas, that adds to this stock that then doesn't get used up if more people use it. If the population doubles, right, that's not going to make the 3, 4, 5 right triangle go away faster. that's not going to make the step-by-step guidelines of how to do kangaroo mother care get used up faster, right? But it might lead to ideas happening that wouldn't otherwise happen. And so a depopulating future would be one where fewer of these ideas and discoveries happen relative to a stabilized future. Now, one question that was asked is, but aren't there other things that we can do to advance the rate of discovery, improve ideas, make better use of the people we have? Yeah, absolutely. And we should do that too, right? We should make sure that every kid gets to go to school as much as as we can. We should improve early life health and nutrition and sanitation so that children grow to their physical and cognitive potentials. We should make it possible for research teams to collaborate across international boundaries and for what it's worth, not, if you want my opinion, not charge $100,000 for visas. But we should do all of these things, and it's still going to matter how many of us there are doing these things. If I can just go on a tangent for a second, like sometimes I get the question like, why did we care about depopulation when we have so many other things to care about in the world, right? And I just have to completely reject the premise of the question, which is that there can only be one thing on humanity's to-do list at a given time. I mean, look at the UN Sustainable Development Goals, which correctly tells us that we have to advance education for girls and women and reduce childhood malnutrition and reduce poverty and fight climate change, and I think protect the oceans is on there, right? I don't know, there are 17 things. And I think, humanity, making a better future has always been a long to-do list. And I'm not telling you to take anything off of that to-do list. And I'm not even telling you to pass any legislation today because A, nobody knows what to do. B, we're talking about something that's coming a few decades from now. What I am saying is that this should, better understanding of the future that we're heading towards of depopulation, thinking hard about whether that's what we want and having conversations like this about it should be added to our, yes, admittedly long to-do list for building a better future.
Any questions or comments on that note?
I'm going to get a cup of water, but I can hear you guys.
Yes.
I can still hear you.
Okay,
I can
great.
hear that nobody's saying anything.
Adam.
Yeah, so there's both the problem of reduced innovation, and then there's also worries about shrinking population and paying off sovereign debt. Can you talk about the innovation, I assume, is the much more pressing worry, but can you talk about the debt problem as well and what the implications are there?
I honestly don't have a lot to say about that. It's not really in the book, in part because I feel like these sort of questions of government budget constraint or the age structure of the population or Social Security and pensions and things like that, they kind of do get a lot of attention already, and people sort of have their opinions about them. And so like our line in After the Spike is, we're not going to try to change your mind about that. But, as you, in my view, correctly said, Adam, these questions about the long-term trajectory of progress are probably a lot bigger for well-being, and also these questions of other people wanting and needing what you want to need helps you get it. So I didn't really dig into that, but in economics, the core idea there is one of fixed costs. That there's a fixed cost of a project happening. So so many of the things that we need or want have this property that there's a fixed cost of the thing existing. So it's only going to happen if there's enough demand, enough users to make it worthwhile. And that's, true for businesses, right? I gave the example of a bakery baking a pie, or like, is a taco truck going to come and be available if it doesn't think there are going to be enough customers, right? So you get more products and more variety if there are more people demanding it. But it's not just about businesses. It's, in some cases about our biggest public projects. Inventing the formula for the COVID vaccine or a COVID vaccine was basically something where it was all about the big fixed cost of having the recipe, not really about the marginal cost of producing your personal dose. And so, what we needed was that fixed cost to happen once. And I think it's worth asking, would we have been likely to have been as successful in getting that when we needed it in a smaller world? It's also the case for like media projects like this one, right? We're here doing this talk, right? And the costs of producing this are pretty much the same, no matter how many people someday listen to the recording, right? And so if they're, or like think of like a podcast or a radio program, right? The cost of producing an episode of All Things Considered is the same fixed cost, no matter how many people listen to it. So in a future where there are 3 times as many people alive to listen to today's episode of All Things Considered, that doesn't deplete it or diminish it or use it up anymore. But it does mean that there are more people to contribute to paying or justifying the fixed costs of making it in the first place. And so we think that this sort of scale effects of fixed costs is going to be one of the huge ways that other people's lives are win-win and good for you. So no, I'm sorry that I don't have more to say about this question of government budgets. If my co-author, Mike Geruso, were here, he might talk about his time working on the Council of Economic Advisors in the White House, where, one of the things that, that he talked about is that, maybe as long as we have productivity gains per worker, that's going to claw back some of the losses. And also that, the average, people think it usually express this in terms of age, right? So the median age in the US is projected to increase by 8 years over the next 75 years. I'm sorry, by 7 years over the next 75 years, from a median age of 38 to a median age of 45, right? And that sounds like a lot if we're thinking about, balancing the government budget and all. But let's not forget that the median age in the US increased over the last 75 years by more than that, by 9 age years, from 29 to 38. And so the projected increase in the average age of the US population over the next 75 years is less than the increase that we've seen over the past 75 years. That doesn't mean, maybe 29 to 38 for some reason isn't quite the same as 38 to 45. That's not the only fact you need to know. But that's, one of the things that we think about when we think these other economic consequences are likely to be even bigger.
So in the book, you frame potential depopulation as a global coordination problem, and it's something that requires collective action. Is there another historical example that you think is similar to this, or do you think it's unique? And if there is something that's similar, what can we learn from that about solving these large-scale coordination problems?
I think that we learn a lot from climate change and climate policy, which has, nobody would say has been perfect, but also has made a lot of progress. We're talking here in 2025, and the UN projects the peak to come about six decades from now in 2084, right? So we can think about 6 decades ago, where climate science and climate policy was. Some people knew some big picture facts, Svante Arrhenius's equation for radiative forcing of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere even before then. But the policy attention of the sort that we might recognize only in the barest way started about 6 decades ago in the 1960s. You have, Johnson giving a speech to Congress talking about CO2 as a pollutant. You have the Mauna Loa Observatory in Hawaii coming online in the late 1950s, right? So really just the barest idea of climate change and carbon dioxide as a policy challenge coming online about 6 decades ago. And so, what if somebody back then had said, one of the things that I sometimes hear, which is, this is far in the future. Why should we be talking about it now, right? I'm really glad that that's not what the first people thinking about climate science and climate policy thought, that they thought it was worthwhile talking about the future. And I think we learned something from that. But I think another thing we learned is that if they had gone out, in 1960, whatever, and said, what we need to do is get rid of the internal combustion engine today, right? They would have been laughed off the public stage. That would have been a ridiculous thing to propose, because it truly would have been at that time a ridiculous thing to propose. But now 6 decades later, that's not so wild, right? And it's reasonable to think that we all could live to see a future with many fewer internal combustion engines in it. And that's because a lot has happened over those 6 decades. We've learned a lot. We've built academic fields and departments and funding mechanisms. At UT, there's a sustainability major. There's the journal Nature Climate Change and other journals on top of that. So there's so much that we've learned over those decades. We've built social movements. We've had political parties around climate change. We've had legislation, right? All happening over a long period of time because people started early. And so here we are looking at a change that might begin 6 decades in the future. And I think it would be a big mistake to say we shouldn't talk about that because it's the future. And I think it would also be a big mistake to say, here I have all the answers, pass my piece of legislation. But it'd also be a big mistake to say, because we don't know what to do, that's the end of the story. I think because we don't know what to do, that's why we should be having conversations like this one, why we should be learning more, starting new research projects, starting more social discussions. I mean, look, especially in a democracy, we're not going to stabilize the population unless there's a broad consensus that that's a good thing to do, right? We're not going to do this unless a lot of people think that it's the right idea, and we're just not there yet, right? Let's be honest. I mean, most people probably still think that unending population growth is the most likely future. And the few that know that that's not the case, probably sort of reflexively think that depopulation is something to welcome. And so let's not put the cart before the horse. The place to start is with having conversations like this one, and learning the facts and talking about what future we should want. So if you think that this is perhaps something important, even if you disagree with most of what I said, talk with someone else about it. Steal my book somehow, give it to somebody, and then have a conversation with them about it, and broaden the set of people talking about this. And so in other words, what I think we learned from I'm going to say success of climate policy over the last 6 decades. Yes, imperfect success. Yes, partial success. But there have been important changes, and what I think we learned from them is that to find our hope and optimism in the realism that sometimes big challenges take a long time to confront.
So you're very candid that this is a problem that we know very little about, that we should have these conversations, that many things have been tried and failed. So I'm curious, if you were able to run any kind of local or global research project or experiment, what would you do, given that you've done a lot of thinking about this topic?
I don't know that I do something very different than I am doing. I mean, I think to a first approximation, I kind of can do whatever research projects I want. Um, um, I am, not the sort of person who does social science by doing small scale randomized field experiments. I'm the sort of person who does social science with a combination of big picture descriptive demographic facts that we learn from big data sets like the demographic and health surveys on the one hand, and in my case, that being really paired with qualitative research, and a long-term presence in a place like Uttar Pradesh where I talk with people there. So I think if I thought that if only I did X, I would learn the magic key, but I just don't have the resource to do X, then believe me, I'd be out there trying to find the resource to do X. But I think I really do believe my own line that more people can learn more than fewer people can. And what I want to see happen is a lot of people taking up these questions and thinking about them. And some of them are going to say things that I think are just bonkers, but that's okay. And so my dream isn't that I become empowered to do a different study. My dream is that a lot of other people think this is important and start, pursuing ideas that I wouldn't think of. I'm excited by the belief that, if I live long enough, I'll see people having awesome social science that I would have never thought of.
Thank you. So we have about 13 minutes left. There's a lot in the book that we haven't covered. For example, we never got through the full discussion about the case against people. So I wanted to open it up to the group for any questions
Before
or
you do that,
topics that we
I
haven't
feel like
gotten
there's
to.
something I have to say, because usually we do talk about these sort of questions of reproductive freedom and gender
Yeah.
equity, and I can't let a conversation happen where I don't say that this isn't a question about whether you or anybody should be a parent or is making a mistake if you choose not to have children. We're talking about whether society overall might be making a mistake if over the long term we don't make it easier for more people to have children. I think that this isn't a question about coercing people to be parents, in part because we know that coercing people to be parents doesn't raise birth rates. I'm talking to you from Texas, where there's been a succession of abortion restrictions. But right now, the birth rate in Texas, or the most recent birth rate in Texas, more than a year after Dobbs and the trigger bills, was 1.81. And 1.81 is not only below 2, but lower than the birth rate in Texas any year before COVID. We've seen countries like South Korea or Ireland go back and forth between people generally having access to reproductive health care or not, and we don't see big differences in birth rates. There's just no evidence that coercion is effective at raising long-term birth rates, in addition to being ethically unacceptable for the whole other reasons, right? So this conversation can really get hijacked with people thinking that low birth rates are a reason to roll back progress towards equity and freedom or make lives worse for women. And I think it's important to say that that's not what we're talking about here, in part because the only way we're ever going to have a future with an average birth rate of 2 is if people choose to be parents. And if more people choose to be parents, then that includes if more women choose to be parents. And that's not going to happen unless we make parenting better and fairer. And so making things worse for women is a way not to raise birth rates. So sorry for what might feel like a footnote or something like that, but it's we shouldn't have a conversation about this where we don't pause to say something like that.
Right. Yeah. And not at all a footnote. I think you make a very compelling case in the book on this topic, and the fact that you're encouraging people to be able to choose. And there are people who want to have children and aren't able to, or choose not to have children, and that's their choice. But it's also a topic that, as you've encouraged us, that we should have collective discussions around. Shine, I'll let you ask a question.
I have a question about the ideal family sizes and people's claims about what they want. 2 questions. First is, there's often says that there's a gap between what women report they want to make their ideal family size. Maybe it's like 2.5 or something, and maybe realized fertility is like 1.5. Do you consider that believable? Is it just a sort of pie in the sky idea, or is it like people are really trying to make 2.5 and like various setbacks cause it to be 1.5. And the second question, I actually spent my childhood in Uttar Pradesh, and I would characterize Indian culture as having almost a suffocating pressure to get married and create grandchildren. So when you say like, wow, even in rural Uttar Pradesh, um, ideal fertility is that low. Is there like longitudinal qualitative data of like, women in 1990 said this, women in 2000 said this, 2010 said this, or was it always like this? Is this changing with time, or is it recent, or did women always just want 2 kids?
Lots of great questions here. So you definitely could look at the different DHSs in India, in 1992, 1990, or whatever, and see, they asked this question, how many kids would you ideally like to have? And you would see it falling over time. Here I don't have that time series for you in a graph immediately. I can show this slide, which I like, which is from the most recent DHS in India, where you see, young women, at sort of the beginning of their, parenting ages really in this population, saying that they want an average of below 2 kids. And it's a little bit cheeky of me. You see me like splitting it by, do they have mobile phones or not? Have they used the internet or not? Because there's this sort of conversation we sometimes hear in the US media about how it's all about mobile phones. And, it's sort of hard to test in a place where everybody has mobile phones, but you can look in a place where not everybody has mobile phones. And you see basically the same answer either way. Take that for what it's worth. I mean, on the bigger picture of what should we think and believe about these survey reported ideal fertility questions, I'm kind of on, I'm in the published record on both sides of the question. On the one hand, there's this famous paper by Lant Pritchett from 1994, where he looks at the old demographic and health surveys and world fertility surveys and says, with each like country and basically developing country as a data point, what's the period birth rate, the birth rate in a year, and what people said in that survey year they wanted. And he says, they're actually kind of closely correlated. Now, it's not perfectly correlated. If you know what an R-squared is, it's something like 77%, right? But pretty closely correlated. Like places where women say that they want more kids are places where people tend to have more kids. Now, it's not exactly straight on the 45-degree line. Maybe there's an intercept, right? That's interesting. But one thing is you say something like that and you worry that maybe people are just saying the number of kids they have is the number of kids they want, but it's going the other way around. You're like, I got three is what I want. I had a grad student a couple of years ago who wrote a paper basically investigating that. His name was Prankar Gupta, and the research has sort of been revised by another of my collaborators, Sangeeta Vyas. And what they did is look at looking at the whole developing world, everywhere there's a demographic health survey, if your first birth is twins rather than a singleton, and if your first birth is a girl rather than a boy, which in many societies leads people to go on to have more children, so your first birth is like twins when you're 20. Then when you're 45, what do you say is the ideal number of children? And when you're 45, if your first birth was twins, you say that the ideal number of children is greater on average than people whose first birth wasn't twins. And so if we think that this is kind of like a randomized experiment, or the sex of your first kid is kind of like a randomized experiment, then we are seeing some evidence that people end up just reporting what they got. And so the sort of Lant Pritchett result wouldn't be as impressive as you think. But it turns again, because we did another paper, this one also with Sangeeta and Melissa Lopalo and Stuart Utalvasan, where there's now been enough demographic and health surveys where you can match cohorts over time. So you can like look at what 20-year-olds in 1992 said they wanted on average in Bangladesh, and then look, not the same people, but a representative national sample of 40-year-olds in Bangladesh in 2012, right? And see what they got, right? And see our country cohorts, and what's the correlation? So do Pritchett's picture again, but holding cohort constant. Our country cohorts where people said they wanted more kids, the ones where people have more kids on average. And stunningly, you basically get the same answer Pritchett did, that it's highly predictive. Not perfectly, but highly predictive. So what is this telling us? There's a lot of signal in these questions where people say what they want, and there's some important noise in these questions where people say what they want. And so what that says to me is, yeah, pay attention to it, but don't overinterpret it. So sometimes in this like US facing literature, you see people talking about, well, people say they want an average of 2.2, but they're actually getting an average of 1.9 or something like that. And I think that's probably slicing and dicing it too thin, especially since you do see what people say they want going down over time. But maybe here's the most important fact. And it's, you do see what people say they want going down over time. So even if there is some sort of hiccup of people saying that they're wanting more than they're getting, you're seeing that shifting down too. So, what's the cause and what's the effect? I don't know, but great question.
Any other questions? We have a couple of minutes left. Adam.
So I have a lot of questions. I guess I'll just pick this one at random. So the issue, the fertility crisis has until, well, my sense is that it's still coded as a conservative issue, and I think the loudest spokesperson for it is Elon Musk, and then also the countries that have been dealing with this issue for the longest maybe include, well, I don't know, but Hungary, Japan, countries that are maybe culturally closed off to immigration. In your in your publicity tour for the book, have you been encountering any resistance to the arguments of the book in terms of thinking that it's so that so I'm thinking that maybe the resistance comes from interpreting you as in favor of reducing gender equality or pushing back against gender norms. But is that still a common conception that this is very much a right or conservative coded cultural issue?
No, thanks for bringing this up. It's important. I don't think that anybody who reads the book would think that that's what we have to say. And I really do encourage you all in our last minute or so to read the book, because the book says it all so much better and in more depth than I can. But part of the project of the book is to broaden the set of people talking about this, because you're right. A lot of the people who have stood up in public and said something about birth rates have done so either from a patriarchal perspective, where they probably wanted that even before they were thinking about birth rates, or have said so from a nationalist perspective, and they probably wanted that even before they were thinking about birth rates. Our book is about global depopulation, and we think that that's what matters. We said other people are win-win, their lives are good for them and good for you, and we think their lives are good for them no matter where they're born, and we think their lives are good for you no matter where they're born. We talked about immigration. In any sort of short run, countries can mitigate some of the effects from immigration, but somebody having a good idea is going to help you. No matter where they're born. You're probably using LED lights right now that were invented in Japan, even though I suspect few of us are joining this call from Japan. And so it matters everywhere where ideas happen. In the long run, immigration is not going to be a solution for everywhere, because even sending countries are having birth rates falling. We didn't end up talking a lot about sub-Saharan Africa, but other places that migrants come from, whether it's South Asia, Latin America, low birth rates now, and so as birth rates fall below 2 everywhere, that's they're not going to be sending migrants in the same way in the very long run. I guess with just like my last utterance, I'll say, I'm glad you asked this, because I think it's important to stand up and be very explicit that there should be a space for everyone in this conversation, because global depopulation is going to be a big change. And even if someone thinks that I'm wrong about what matters about it, we all have a stake in understanding this big future. And so if you have been hearing this conversation and worried that, social conservatives or voices on the right like JD Vance are the, loud people out there talking about it, and that makes you want to not participate, what I have to say is, don't let them be the only ones talking about this. The way that we're going to build a better conversation about what sort of future we want for the world population is by joining it and participating in it. So thank you all for joining me and doing that today.
Thank you so much, Dean, for sharing your Tuesday night with us. And thank you, everyone, for joining. I learned a lot from the book. It definitely got me thinking more about climate and innovation, and also having more voices in the conversation. So I hope everyone reads the book. And yeah, thank you and have a great night.
Thanks, everyone.